Hello, I'm Karma Kitaj, and I'm your host for A Livelihood, New Adventures as We Age. Today I'm going to introduce you to Bruce Frankel, and Bruce has recently published a book which I was very impressed by, and I'm not easily impressed these days by books about what are we going to do with the rest of our lives, because I've read and reviewed a lot of them, but this one is special. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Karma. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
So why don't you talk about how the idea for that book even came about?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the lovely review you did write about it. The story is really fairly complicated in some ways and simple in others, but I had decided when I was in my early 50s, 51, to leave my job as a editor at People magazine. I was a senior writer and editor, and
you had been in that field as a journalist for what, 20 years or
yes,
so?
I had been a reporter at USA Today for 6 or 7 years. I was the New York-based national reporter for USA Today and wrote a lot about organized crime and terrorism, the first World Trade Center bombing and all the trials and all the major mob trials and trials of major figures. And I had gone to People magazine for a few years. I worked as a senior writer and editor, and when I was in my 40s, a little earlier, I had cancer and had at that time begun to feel like the clock was ticking on me, and really began thinking then probably that I had started out life wanting to be a poet, and that aspiration gnawed at me that I had not really succeeded in pursuing that. And so when I was 51, I decided to leave journalism and went back to school to get an MFA in poetry at Sarah Lawrence College. A friend of mine was turning 60, and he was a ghostwriter, had written a number of books, and we had a celebratory lunch at a sushi place to celebrate his birthday, but he came and he was distressed because the book that he was about to write, and which looked like it would be a big money maker for him, had blown up in the press. So it turned into a rather morbid lunch, and he was severely depressed, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do too, and I went home from that lunch turning over ideas and walked home. By the time I reached my apartment, I had this rather whimsical idea that that we would together collaborate and write a book about people who succeeded in life after 60. By the time I reached home that day, I called Jim up and I said whimsically, let's do this book. And he hemmed and hawed and wasn't really sure we could figure out a way to do it that would work. He ended up getting another contract for a book, and I was kind of left with my own good idea, which in truth, it started out as somewhat of a shallow idea. I didn't really know very much about the field of positive aging. I did know that boomers were about to start turning 60 then. Now they're turning 65. I didn't want to write a book that was just prescriptive. I wanted to write a book in which the reader...
You didn't want to do a how-to...
I didn't want
to do a book.
Right. I didn't want to do a how-to book. I wanted to write a book that people would read the stories and they would find in the stories themselves things that they could relate to, see themselves in, and understand how their own stories could change. So that was the genesis of the book. And then it took me about 2 or 3 years of interviewing and spending time with people and having my own sense of aging change. What I found was, as I found these great models for life after 60, people who I chose also in the book, I chose people who had not had great success prior in life. All but one had had fairly modest success in their lives, if any success at all. Mm-hmm. And I really learned over the course of 2 or 3 years, it changed the timeline of my own life. Rather than seeing life as, and my working life as short-circuited and ending maybe when I was 60, suddenly I realized that there was a great opportunity for continuing to be productive and happy and expanding and challenging myself. And all the things that we now talk about, I really learned from the subjects that in the book.
So we also have a couple of pictures about a sculptor, right?
Yeah, Ted Levitzik, who's also, he has a marvelous story. And again, a tremendously inspirational account. Ted had grown up in Poland in a town called Otwok, which was outside of Warsaw. And he had grown up there during the Nazi occupation. His town had been 50% Jewish. There were 30,000 people in the town at the beginning of the war. One night, the Nazis came in, and 15,000 of them, all Jews, were removed. His family was Christian, but all his friends were Jewish. At any rate, Ted survived the war and managed to escape Stalinist Poland and stowed away on a ship, in fact, and circuitously ended up in the United States and worked for many years until he was past 60 as a contact lens grinder or maker, which was something he fell into because he had metric skills. That was the only reason. And after he retired, he decided, he lived on a house on the side. He still lives there. He's now 70. He's now 87. The house he lives in is on the side of a hill that slopes into the Hudson River. And he decided in his retirement he would build a seawall to protect his property against encroachments of the Hudson River. And he spent a year carrying cement down this very steep hill and material to build the wall. And when he was done, he stepped back into the water at low tide one day and thought the wall looked blank, and at that moment looked down into the water and saw a beautiful stone. And he picked it up and got a broken lawnmower blade and a hammer and chiseled the face into the stone and plastered it onto the wall. And the next day he returned and thinking he'd be overjoyed, but when he looked at it, he felt the face looked lonely because it was by itself. And so he went in search of another. And then fast forward many years later, there are now, I think, about 160 statues of all sizes on his property. He's collected by museums around the country, and he's a remarkable sculptor. And
he's still sculpting.
Yeah.
So now that the book has been out for a couple years or something,
yes.
hasn't it?
Yes.
How do you think it's affected you, thinking about these stories?
Well, it affects me all the time because I still, like most people, am trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And as a writer, you're always up against that. What are you going to do next? And how are you going to pay the bills? And I learned lessons about how to really achieve things. So by setting goals, by having aspirations, by being disciplined, by dreaming big sometimes, by not letting naysayers get in the way, by surrounding yourself with people who affirm what you're doing.
Well, we have come to the end of our time here.
Well,
we have much more that we could be talking about.
It was the delight.
Well, thank you so much for coming, Bruce.
Happy to be here.
Okay.